I'd like to introduce our host and psychotherapist for the series I Am Not Okay, Kim Christink. Kim is the founder and executive director of Bayridge Counselling Centres and Human Strong, which is part of the Bayridge Circle of Care. He is an author and creator of several mental health programs in the area of mood disorder and anger management. For several years, Kim hosted a call-in national talk show called Nightlight and has appeared on numerous national talk shows speaking to the issues of mental health and relationships. Over his 40-year career, Kim has intimately worked with thousands of individuals, couples, and families to help navigate the challenges of mental, emotional, and relational health. Please welcome Kim Christink.
Thank you, Amy. Gabor Maté is an internationally renowned speaker, highly sought after for his expertise on addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. After 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience, Dr. Maté worked for over a decade in Vancouver's downtown east side with patients challenged by drug addiction and mental illness. He is the best-selling author of 4 books published in over 25 languages. His book on addiction received the Hubert Evans Prize for Literary Nonfiction. For his groundbreaking medical work and writing, he has been awarded the Order of Canada and the Civic Merit Award from his hometown, Vancouver. His books include In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addictions, When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress, Scattered Minds, The Origins and Healing of Attention Deficit Disorder, Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. Gabor has a new book just released called The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture. Gabor is also co-developer of a therapeutic approach, compassionate inquiry, now studied by hundreds of therapists, physicians, counselors, and others internationally. I'm so delighted that you could make it and give this time for us. I'd like to jump in with an area that you certainly have tried to shine a light on, and that is the whole connection with the body and the mind. And so can we just start jumping into a conversation about trauma? Stress, trauma, and the link between the body and the mind. Can you talk about that for just a minute?
Sure. So, even to talk about a connection between the body and the mind is misleading, because it denotes 2 separate entities connected to one another. But in fact, there are no 2 separate entities. And as the great scientific researcher Candace Pert writes in her book, Molecules of Emotion, it's the body-mind. So really, it's one unit. It's not even that they're connected. It's body-mind. Now, if you look at it, say statistically, if you want to see the interaction of trauma, stress, and health, and the body-mind, look at the multiple, I'm talking about thousands of studies that have shown intrauterine stress and early childhood stress and early childhood trauma significantly increases the risk of adult illness. Whether we call it mental illness or physical illness, from autoimmune disease to cancer to heart disease, chronic conditions of all kinds, all of these identified diseases are potentiated significantly by intrauterine stress, early childhood stress, and trauma. So that's the statistical fact. So, for example, Canadian study, when men had been sexually abused in childhood have tripled the risk of heart disease and over 50% of the risk of malignancy. This is regardless of lifestyle factors, so-called, such as smoking or drinking. that doesn't delineate the mechanisms. I'm stating the obvious fact or the demonstrated fact that the more diversity, stress earlier on, significantly the higher the risk of disease later on. And this is true for autoimmune conditions, malignancies, mental illnesses, diseases of all kinds. So that's the first point. And the second point then is, well, why should that be the case? Well, why that is the case is because the body-mind is one unit. And when things happen emotionally, they manifest physiologically. And that happens through multiple pathways which have been elegantly delineated. They're hardly, in fact, they're not controversial, except for the fact that nobody in medical school ever hears about them. So physicians have been trained in this biological view of physical and mental illness. It's all about the body, the biology of the body, and we are not trained to understand what in 1977 the physician and psychiatrist George Engel called a biopsychosocial perspective, which posits that human beings can't be understood without recognizing the interaction of biology, psychology, and our social relationships. And as far back as in 1938, there was an astounding lecture given by a leading physician at Harvard Medical School that was published in the Journal of the Medical Association in 1938 or 39. This is a man called Soma Weiss, whose memory is still recognized at Harvard. There's a research day in his honor to this day, but nobody talks about what he actually taught. And he said in this remarkable lecture that emotional factors are as important in the causation of illness as physiological factors, and it must be at least as important in the healing of them. Now, since Engel and in 77 and Weiss in 1938 propounded these insights, there's been just, again, a whole cornucopia of scientific evidence as to why. And why is because the emotional system in the brain, the psyche, the nervous system, and the hormonal apparatus and the immune system are not separable. They're one unit, they're one system with different sub-specialized manifestations given the complexity of the human organism. So therefore you have this science called psycho-neuro-immunoendocrinology, which means the pathways connecting or unifying the psyche, the emotional system, our mental states, the nervous system, the immune system, and the hormonal apparatus. So, to make a very long story as short as possible, we're physiologically one unit. Whatever happens or manifests psychologically will also do so physiologically through the connections, the proven physiological anatomical connections and neurochemical connections between the mind and the brain and the immune system and the nervous system and the hormonal apparatus and the gut and the heart and every cell in the body.
Right. So, every cell in the body. Yeah. Can we just spend a second on that whole thing that you just brought up in terms of medicine's hidden biases that they tend to ignore or have blinders on during their training? Is there other biases that you see that are obvious or not paying attention to? We need to more?
Yes, and what you're describing here is the nature of an ideology. An ideology may incorporate some accurate information, but it'll also have perspectives of points of view that are automatic, that it's not actually conscious of. So as much as we like to think of Western medicine as scientific, and of course it is significant and beneficial and, in fact, miraculous scientific aspects and achievements, at the same time it incorporates ideological perspectives, automatic assumptions that it doesn't see beyond, doesn't even know that these are assumptions. Well, one of them is the separation of mind and body, which is what Soma Weiss decried in 1938, George Engel decried in 1977. And I was talking to a leading physician, psychiatrist at Harvard only last year, who said that until recently, to talk about mind-body medicine at Harvard was to jeopardize your career.
Wow.
Which is astounding. Now, so the hidden assumptions are that mind and body are separate. Number two, that individuals are isolated entities who can be understood outside of their emotional relationships and outside of their social relationships. Furthermore, that the way to study this is only through biological means, and largely, and by trying to understand the intricacies of cells and genes and genetic activity, we're going to get to the answers about health and illness in this world. That's another bias. Another bias, of course, is how we gather information, so that we don't listen to people's stories. We call them anecdotal. Well, for God's sakes, anecdotal speaks to human experience. Now, there's certain things you can study by excluding anecdotes, but there's a lot of things you'll never understand unless you listen to people's stories. So these are some of the hidden biases. And of course, these biases of medicine are not simply the blindnesses of individual physicians. They also represent the fundamental assumptions of a certain socioeconomic system. So that, again, we can't separate the ideology of medicine from the ideology of industrial capitalism, which is another assumption, is somehow we can treat these as separate entities. So I could go on, but the blind spots are not just ideological, they're also emotional. Because it's astounding. Like this, we're going to talk about trauma here, but the average medical school student does not receive a single in-depth course on trauma, despite the documented effect of trauma on the brain, despite the documented impact of trauma in chronic illness, multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, malignancy. Ultimately, every chronic condition can be significantly related to trauma, documentably. The average medical student doesn't hear a single word. Or maybe they hear a word these days, but they don't get a single in-depth course, even if they even get a single lecture, which most of them don't. So now, that blind spot, partly it's ideological, but partly it's also emotional, because it's something that doctors just have trouble handling. Why? Because they're so traumatized themselves so very often. And
can we talk about that in terms of traumatized? I've listened and thought. I've had friends who went through the medical school and the profession, and they feel like they have lost 10 years of their life. They didn't develop, they didn't grow. They were so saturated with just the books, the learning, the etc. They became perfectionistic. They lived in great pressure, and then I think if I've got it right, correct me if I'm wrong, Gabor, that after you went through school and got established, you went through a depression. Is that correct, or you had depression symptoms?
Oh yeah, I was in my 40s. I was a very successful family physician. I was the medical coordinator of Canada's largest palliative care unit and hospital unit. I was writing articles for newspapers. I was a father of 3 kids, all the success in the world, and I was depressed and listless, except when I was working. So I was both a workaholic and depressed.
And so success doesn't necessarily lead to health.
Well, on the contrary, very often this society rewards people who drive themselves into ill health, and we think they're great, wonderful people. Now, when you said that medical doctors felt they lost 10 years of their lives, literally, there's, I don't know if, do you know what telomeres are? Telomeres?
No.
All right.
Yeah.
So telomeres, Elizabeth Blackburn, an American scientist, won the Nobel Prize in 2014, I think, for her work on telomeres. Telomeres are DNA structures at the end of our chromosomes, and fundamentally they enhance life and health. And we're born with a certain length, 10,000 units of them, and by death we're three or 4,000. So that they get eroded with age, but they also get eroded with stress. And they've been likened to the glue at the end of your shoelace that keeps the strands from unraveling. So the more telomeral damage we sustain, the less healthy we are. Well, they compared the telomere length of medical residents with other people their age. In a year, they shortened a lot more in the medical group.
Wow.
And then that's so what I'm saying is the people that go into medicine, like me, are very often very driven people, very ambitious. We want to do good in the world for sure, but it's never just one motive. For me, another motive was I needed that respectability, I needed that recognition, I needed that status and that security. Well, why did I need that recognition? Because of my own early childhood trauma, I didn't value myself. So I needed to be important in the world in order to feel valued. Well, that's addictive. So these are the people that, not exclusively, but predominantly, drive themselves hard enough to get into medical school, are willing to put up with the stress and trauma and pressures and insults of medical training. And then the harder they work, the more they're rewarded and admired. In other words, the more they drive themselves into illness, the greater they are. So, my wife would go into a department store or grocery supermarket and pay with her credit card. And the teller checkers would, oh, are you the wife of that wonderful doctor? And she would grit her teeth because that wonderful doctor was not available for his own family, was irritable and depressed to be around, except when he was working. So that's
that reminds me of talking to a friend of mine who was talking about his father's funeral, and everyone kind of, when their friends from work spoke about him, the wife and the kids, adult kids, looked around saying, "Who is this guy that was so wonderful at work?" And then he asked himself, "Is that what I'm doing now as well? Giving my best self to the work families rather than to our families themselves?" But yeah, I also I have a memory that my wife threatened to make an appointment with her to have an hour of my conversation and my full attention, like I gave my clients. But it's not a great thing to be asking about. Can we talk about how can children that, and for yourself for sure, but trauma, grow up living with fear and pain and trauma and them not even be aware of it?
Well, you don't have a previous life to compare it to. It's not like most of us can say, oh, in my previous existence, I had a functional family with a father who was present and playful and joyful, and a mother who was attuned and loving. Whatever happens to us, that's our normal. And a lot of people who grow up with stress and fear, if that's lacking, they don't even feel normal. So typically, I see this with women all the time, is that they grow up with stress and trauma and fear. Inevitably, they'll gravitate towards men who will generate those conditions for them. You think, why?
So
Because
normal is living with fear.
The normal is the fear. The normal is the stress. For me, I was professionally, I could always function very well in the midst of stress. In fact, the palliative care nurses who really loved working with me because I was good at what I did, but they said that working with me was like working in the eye of a tornado. So when there was stress around, I just felt right at home. Multiple decisions and making important choices, and it's when things were quiet and nothing was happening that I tended to feel really uncomfortable, not knowing what to do with myself. So the normality of stillness was for me abnormal.
And so, were you unconsciously creating or always looking for chaos or organized chaos?
I was unconsciously creating it. I was generating it. That's how I functioned. And that got the great stress researcher Hans, or give him his Hungarian name, János Selye, Selye. He's the one that coined the word stress the way we use it today. He pointed out that people can get addicted to their own stress hormones. So I was, we talk about adrenaline junkies. It's actually true.
And would that be representative how I think you've written this, used the phrase, my hidden limp? Would that be reference to your addiction or your repressed emotional needs?
No, that if I get the reference that you're citing here, that's another dynamic. So I was telling the story in one of my book When the Body Says No, which is all about the body-mind unity and how stress that we're not aware of, but we generate for ourselves, lies underneath, potentiates chronic illness like autoimmune disease, malignancy, and so on. It's called When the Body Says No. In that, I tell the story. And the whole point is that a lot of people are programmed in childhood to suppress their own awareness of their pain, or at least not to show it to their parents, because somehow they sense that the parents can't handle more stress, or somehow they sense that to express how they feel would threaten the relationship with the parent, which is not negotiable for the child. So we learn to suppress and hide our discomfort. A lot of people do, which generates a lot of stress in life, which potentiates a lot of illness. So the story I was telling was my mother was around 78, actually the same age as I am now, I suppose. And she was in a nursing home because in our family, there's a genetic disorder, muscular dystrophy. Now, most diseases are not genetic, or genes have little to do with them, but this disease, as a few others, are genetic. If you have the gene, you'll get the disease. My mother had the gene. By age 78, she was immobile, barely able to lift her hand to feed herself. She couldn't get out of bed by herself, and so on. Mentally, she was completely sharp. So I was visiting her, and as I was walking down the hall of the nursing home towards her room, I was limping. And the reason I was limping is because that morning I'd had arthroscopic surgery on one of my knees. And the reason I had arthroscopic surgery is because I used to jog and I would ignore the pain. So eventually one of my menisci tore. I had to have it removed. That morning I had a bit of a limp as I was walking down a nursing home hall. When I opened the door to my mother's room, the limp disappears. I didn't think about it. The limp just automatically disappears. And I walk out again without a limp after the visit, and I start limping again. as I leave the nursing home. But what the heck was going on? There was an unconscious suppression. There was an unconscious suppression of my limp in order not to bother my mother. Now, here's the point. My mother, at age 78, had lived through the Second World War, genocide, the communist dictatorship, refugee status, tragedy across the Austrian border, immigrants in Canada, all that. Did she need to be protected from the fact that her 52-year-old or 54-year-old son had a bit of a limp the morning of arthroscopic surgery? She didn't. This was an ancient dynamic that had been triggered, that had been ingrained into me in childhood. But I was still acting it out 53 years later.
Right. Wow. And so what made you aware of that? Did you all of a sudden become aware, Gabor, or?
Well, I noticed the limp as soon as I left. I said, "What happened here?" But but more generally, what happened was that because I was depressed and my marriage was very stressed and my relationship with my kids wasn't what I wanted it to be, I had to start asking questions, and that's when I really began to. And also, of course, as a physician, if your eyes are open, you see things. So I began to notice that the chronically ill people, and I knew people before they got sick, and I knew their multi-generational histories, which is something specialists don't get to do. But as a family physician, I did. And it became really clear to me, and then in palliative care especially, it became really clear to me that, people who get sick with chronic illness or develop depression or some chronic physical condition, it's not accidental. There were certain patterns in their lives. And so my awareness was sourced from two origins. One is me having to deal with my own I don't call it dysfunction, my own suffering, actually. And also noticing the patterns in the families and the patients that I looked after. And I began to see the relationship between multi-generational trauma, childhood stress and trauma, attachment relationships in early life, and how they played out in terms of health and illness later on in life. So the patterns just became unavoidable for me. And what I didn't know, of course, is that there have been others noticing the same things, because you don't get taught this stuff in medical school. But when I started looking at the literature, let me tell you a story. In writing When the Body Says No, I researched all over the place, and I went to the Cancer Agency of British Columbia, the BC Cancer Agency, and I spoke to the head counselor there, the psychologist there, and I said, I'm writing a book on chronic illness, including malignancy and stress. What can you tell me? And she said, we don't believe there's any such connection. Then I went to their library, where there was only 1,000 articles showing a relationship between stress and malignancy. It was unbelievable. So, so, a lot of the research I did was at the library of this agency, where the head psychologist says there's no such connection. She wasn't even aware of the literature that was in her own library.
So that was another unconscious bias within her discipline.
Absolutely, yeah. They were all behaviorists.
Yeah, right. Wow. And so suffering, you began to pay attention to your suffering. Is that what I heard?
I couldn't ignore it. Not if I wanted to stay married and be related to my children, and actually feel better myself.
Well, sometimes, Gabor, in my work, I sometimes think that the strong-willed and the strident individuals, so it sometimes works against them, because it takes them longer to pay attention to the pain or the suffering, that's asking them to change, and they hang on longer, and they suffer longer, and they persevere longer, and instead of listening to the pain that's trying to talk to them.
That's true. Only I wouldn't call that strong-willed. I call it willful. There's a difference.
What do
You
you
can be
mean?
strong. You can be strong-willed in the right direction.
Okay.
But if you're ignoring the message of reality, you're not being strong-willed. You're being willful. Your will is not. You're not in charge of your will. Your will is in charge of you. You're in denial. And a lot of people are willfully in denial. I mean, we see that in every area of life and politics.
I like that, actually, and especially when we talk about the locus of control to manage and be responsible for our own lives and ourselves. That is we need to be able to, it's not a good word, to capture your will, but to gain responsibility to give it direction, rather than, as you say, letting our fears or unconscious or suppressed feelings being the more powerful one, for sure. Can we talk a bit about? Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm
No
just
problem.
reading another biography of Adolf Hitler, and of course, will was a big part of his ideology. And the film that was made by Leni Riefenstahl about, I think about Hitler, but maybe it was one of the Olympics held in Berlin. It was called Triumph of the Will. But triumph of the will over what? So will on its own can lead us into all kinds of terrible directions if it's driven by unconscious forces.
Correct. Yes. And that kind of circles back to where I want to visit, and that is when we talk about our authentic self. What is our authentic self?
Well, have you had the experience ever of being in interaction with somebody, with a group or an individual, and then afterwards you feel a bit ashamed? You say, I wasn't myself. I wasn't quite who I am. Did you ever have that experience?
Yes, actually I have. Yeah.
Okay. Now who's recognizing that?
my quiet observer. I don't know. It's hard to describe.
Well, who recognizes the inauthenticity? That's your authentic self.
And I like that. I'm kind of getting my head around that in terms of how often are we aware then of our authentic self?
Well, that's highly individual, I think. And in this society, we're programmed not to be. I just written my new book, and I talked about Eric Fromm's concept of the social character. And a social character is basically who the society wants us to be. And what it doesn't want us to be is our authentic selves. Because the authentic self doesn't need all the junk products that are pervaded by this culture. Nor would it put up with all the anti-human values that are dominant in the culture. So how often is it present? I think what's often present is an awareness that it's not present. I mean, I know when I'm not being myself. And it's a question of how much attention do I want to pay on the one that knows. Now, one of my contentions is, and I believe I can prove it scientifically, but it seems obvious to me that illness very often comes along because we were not our authentic selves. This is not a moral condemnation or blaming anybody. It's just that in order to maintain our attachment relationships in childhood, we had to suppress ourselves and our emotions. That'll have lifelong impacts, and one of them is the potential for illness. Like, take something like depression. What does it mean to? I mean, depression. It's a clinical term, but what does the English phrase depression actually means? What does it mean to depress something? I'm asking.
To push down?
To push it down. Now, what is pushed down in depression? You've dealt with a lot
Pushing
of depressed people.
down yourself and your feelings, your emotions, what you're experiencing.
Exactly. So sometimes we recognize the absence of the authentic self by the cost that is exacted when we have been suppressing it. And whether we're talking about chronic physical illness or mental illness, so-called, it's often a consequence of the abandonment, the enforced abandonment in childhood of the authentic self. And that healing, certainly from a psychological point of view, therapeutic point of view, like when I teach I teach a course called Compassion Inquiry, which is my particular methodology of therapy. And
Mhm.
what I tell my students at the last lecture is that what is the what is the goal of therapy? Well, the goal of therapy is to help the emergence of your authentic self in the present moment. That's our very goal, because just about everything that brings somebody into your office has to do with some abandonment, some enforced, ingrained, unconscious, non-blameworthy abandonment of the authentic self. And a lot of people who get physically ill find the same thing. So there's a best-selling book called Dying to Be Me by Anita Moorjani, who talks about her near fatal lymphoma. She literally had to be at death's door before she realized that this cancer had a lot to do with her suppression of self. So sometimes we suffer into it.
What I was wondering about is those who are lost in denial or in the actual process of depressing some of their emotions, is it because they're afraid that if they feel it will be suffering, it will feel like suffering? And so do we need to learn to not be so afraid of suffering as long as there's someone there with us who will be compassionate with us?
Well, that's exactly the key. If we had suffered in childhood, but there'd been anybody there to hear us and see us and receive us and accept us and validate us, we would not have been traumatized. Suffering and trauma are not the same thing. People can suffer without being traumatized. The trauma happens because we're so alone with it that the wounding becomes ingrained in us. So then we don't want to experience those emotions again, because our memory is that as infants and children, those emotions were unbearable because we didn't have the support.
Right.
Therefore, the healing has to happen in support. So if you don't want to suffer, if you don't want to be aware of your emotions, you become a politician. Both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, in almost similar terms, were asked if they go for therapy, if they ever study themselves, and they both said no, because we're afraid to find out what we might experience. They both said that.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I love that. If we have been injured in our emotional areas, and as you say, that it's the body mind, that it's now chemically and neurologically held in the body in trauma, that we don't want to experience that because there was no response. And it must be very terrifying for clients or people who have been traumatized to want to visit that again. And
well, so it is, but again, the enzyme that dissolves the terror is compassion. And so, as one of my teachers said, only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to see the truth. So the essence of the therapeutic relationship is compassion. If that's not there, I don't care how good your skills are or how brilliant your insights are and how many degrees you have. If you're not able to create that compassionate relationship, it's not going to get anywhere. So compassion then is the context that allows those fears and pains to be experienced. So our job as therapists is not to keep people from pain. That's not kind at all, because the pain is already there. They're carrying it. They're manifesting it through their illnesses, through ther mental health diagnoses, through their relationship issues, through their self-loathing, whatever. The pain is already there. But if we don't allow people to experience that consciously and to actually look at it, we're not being kind to them. So our job is not to protect people from pain. Our job is not to induce it or to evoke it deliberately. That's terrible. But also to create the context where it can arise spontaneously when and if it needs to. And that person can, with confidence, experience it because they have your support. And they're not going to be attacked or judged or shamed or condemned for it. So that's the essence. That's the essence of therapy, as far as I'm concerned.
That's powerful. It seems like science seems to be at odds with religion and religion at odds with science. And can you speak to the aspect of the body-mind connection within us, but does it also have a spiritual connection that impacts your thinking on health?
Well, I mean, there's fairly clear studies that people who are belong to religious communities, they tend to do better physically. Now, is that spiritual, or is it because they have a sense of connection with other human beings? I'm not sure. But if you look at it, from my understanding, here's what it looks like. If you look at the indigenous traditions here in North America, they often talk about the medicine wheel. And the medicine wheel can do, north, south, east, west. But there's all these different dimensions, including physical, mental, psychological, social, and spiritual. And we're not complete without all these quadrants being unified. So there is something about human beings. We are spiritual creatures in the sense that there's something in us that not only wants to belong to something greater, but longs for the experience of belonging to something greater, or longs for the realization of that experience. I mean, in reality, of course, we do belong to something greater. I mean, let's face it, we all begin as little drops of matter and end up as dust. I mean, that it's just dust recycling itself, isn't it? So obviously we're part of something greater, but belong for that experience. And I think whether you're religious or not, that longing for belonging is within us. That's what I consider to be our spiritual aspect.
And I agree, and I think science and religion have not always found what they did have in common. and work on the strengths of that rather than looking at how we look at it differently or do it differently. Um, and
Well,
and I think
well, if you look at some very great scientists, not that I think just because somebody's a great scientist, therefore they're wise people, not necessarily. But if you take somebody like Einstein, he was deeply spiritual, and his spirituality had nothing to do with religion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So he saw no contradiction.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, when we come to spirituality, meaning, and purpose, it's really difficult to talk about those issues if you are not listening to your authentic self. Would you think that's true?
Yes, but it's remarkable how many people at some point come to the realization that their work is meaningless. It's not satisfying. It may be successful, but it's meaningless. That's Viktor Frankl's famous title, "Man's Search for Meaning." Meaning is actually one of our needs as human beings. So we can talk about our needs in terms of the physical ones; they're obvious. But we also have a need for meaning. We need to feel that we make a difference, that our presence matters, that what we do makes a difference, and that it's not just all random chance. So that's a deep human meaning. And people find that out at various stages of their lives. Some of them, tragically, may never find it out. And some people, for economic and social reasons and racial reasons, are so oppressed and so downtrodden that sheer survival is a challenge. So, in a sense, talking about meaning is sometimes a bit of a luxury, but at the same time, it does represent a genuine human need. And if you look at, otherwise, why were there slave revolts? Why did even the best treated slaves, if I can talk about well treated slaves, why did everybody hate slavery? Because we have a need for independence and to define who we are for ourselves, not to be told by somebody else who you are. That itself is part of the meaning that human beings require.
Can I ask you, Gabor, what have you defined as your life's work?
Well, a few years ago, I did actually.
Are you still trying to protect your mother? Are you still trying to protect your mother or family members?
Not nearly so much. No, I'm not. I did a workshop. When I say did, I participated in a workshop about 4 or 5 years ago now, which is all about what is your calling. And you might have said that by then, at age 74 or 3, I would have known what my calling is. And of course, I was wanting to help the world and all that, but it became very clear to me what my calling is. My calling is that people are free. And so that's how I approach therapeutic work. That's how I approach political life. My calling is that people are free. It bothers me that they're not. And whether I see that here in Canada, or whether I see it in Israel, Palestine, or whether I see it in the US, wherever I see lack of freedom, it bothers me. My calling is that people are free. It also means that they're free of their childhood programming and the kind of traumatic imprints that have them automatically acting out dynamics that don't serve their interests and keep them imprisoned. So freedom for me is a very broad concept, but it's where I find meaning.
Can you dream for a minute with me and say, if someone begins to realize they are free and they begin to accept and love their authentic self, what potential, what is the future for someone like that?
What is the present for something like that? That's the real question. I mean, and their capacity to be present to their authenticity will define their future. And I don't,
which will
whatever that,
like, it could look like all kinds of things. It could look like all kinds of different things.
It'll look like whatever their circumstances, their capacities, and their choices allow them to be. But what they'll not end up with is any regret about any of it.
Right. Interesting. My thoughts, like I think a lot of our thoughts, go to people like yourself, medical doctors, nurses, pharmacists, aid workers in a pandemic time that are wrestling with burnout. And what would you wish for them to be able to do better in, or to be able to not just cope, but learn to thrive in this stressful time? What would you wish for them?
Well, the problem for healthcare workers in our system, and I include nurses, aides, physicians, nurses, technicians, anyone, specialists, is that we're taught physical skills only in a relatively minor fashion, if at all, are we taught about emotional skills of how to be with human beings. Which means that our lack of knowledge will itself generate a lot of stress for our work. But least of all are we taught how to honor ourselves and deal with our own stresses. So what the healthcare system, forget COVID, at the best of times, the healthcare system has a lot of stressed people trying to look after a lot of other stressed people without regard for their own stresses. So what I would wish for them is for the system is to actually build incorporate, both in the education and in the practice of healthcare, an understanding of stress and how to recognize it, how not to generate it, how not to inflict it on others, and how to clear it out of yourself once you realize that you're stressed. That's what I would wish.
Wow. And what would be some first steps if someone was listening and saying, I know I'm highly stressed in this? What would be some first steps to care for yourself, to clear that stress out? Would you make some recommendations?
Well, self-servingly, I'd recommend they read my book When the Body Says No, or the new one that'll be out next September called The Myth of Normal. But short of reading such great literature, I suggest they ask themselves a simple question: where am I not saying no? Where I want to say no? But there's a no inside me that wants to be said, but I don't say it. And that happens in two major areas, in our work life and in our personal life. Where am I not saying no?
And
just write it down.
Yeah, that's very good. Sometimes, Gabor, I say yes and no are always connected to each other. You can't say yes to something without saying no to something else.
In fact, you can't say yes at all unless you know how to say no. Like your yes, without a no, your yeses don't mean a thing. If I asked you, "Do you love me?" and you said yes, but you have no in your vocabulary, your yes would be totally meaningless.
Right.
And so, and it's not accidental that at age 1.5, what is the word that the kids start saying first?
No.
Exactly. Nature built us that way for a good reason. Wouldn't it be nice if Mother Nature had programmed a yes, hey, Sonny boy, it's time for dinner. Yes. Time to get
Maybe that's
dressed.
maybe that's why
I
as parents we've so focused on saying yes, so we condition them to always try and say yes.
know. And in other words, we're conditioning them to suppress themselves, is what we're doing. Nature put that no in there for a good reason. Because without that capacity to say no, your yeses don't mean anything. And if your capacity to say no has been suppressed, you're going to be in trouble for the rest of your life.
Well, I'm so thankful. Is there anything else that you would like to say about your work, your book, or your future book, or just for those who are struggling with possibly? You mentioned the whole aspect of the emotions and the mind, the body, mind, and so often we might tend to blame ourselves for our own illnesses. And could you speak to that just as we wrap up today?
Yes. So, as I've been indicating, I've noticed and studied and researched the relationship between people's emotional patterns and chronic illnesses of mind and body, or mind body. And so people that don't know how to say no, they're at high risk for autoimmune disease, multiple sclerosis, malignancy, and so on. They just are. But to point that out is not to in any way indicate blame, because I already talked about why that happens. That suppression of authenticity wasn't some capricious, willful decision on the part of a 1.5-year-old, or a 2-year-old, or a 5-year-old. That was a survival mechanism to maintain your attachment relationship with your caregivers. And it was unconscious. It's not that you woke up one morning and said, I better start suppressing myself. It's an automatic unconscious process designed to protect you and protect your relationship. So it actually had a survival value to start with. Why would I blame you? Or for that matter, why would I blame myself for some pattern that I developed as a 1-year-old unconsciously before I had any choice in the matter? So there's no blame here whatsoever. In fact, blame is completely inappropriate, unscientific, and cruel. But on the other hand, if you come to me with a chronic health condition, and if I ask you, where have you not been saying no? And if I can guide you towards your authentic self that will look after you, I can tell you documentably your chances of doing well with that illness are much better. Would you rather not have me talk about it, or should I talk about it? But again, not with blame. So there's no blame here whatsoever.
Well, Gabor, I am very thankful that you afforded us with this time in a very busy schedule, but I'm more grateful for the gift of your continued vulnerability that continues to teach so many of us how to be free, to love our authentic self, and to become stronger humans. Thank you again for sharing with me. I so appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure to speak with you. Take care.
Okay, thanks.